Hello everyone, welcome to our June CPD in 43 event. Today we have James Dean of the WBC Group based in Bath, presenting practical party wall tips for architectural technologists. He's a really good friend of mine. We've known each other ever since we were in school, so we go way back. So I will hand it over to James, and I will, as usual, I will be here to field any questions, and we'll come back in for the Q&A session. But I'll hand it over to James for about 30 minutes. Please, if you do have any questions, please field them in the chat box, and we can obviously raise those in a discussion at the end. So without further ado, I will disappear into the background.
Hi, James here. And first of all, thank you to CIAT Wessex region for having me. I'm just going to share my screen now. Give me 2 seconds. There you are. Excellent. Okay. Yeah, so you'll have to apologize if it looks like I'm winking at anyone today. I'm not. I have a bad eye in my right eye, so you might see me squinting a little bit to see stuff on the screen. So moving on, so who am I? So James Dean, I'm the Managing Director of WBC Group. I'm a fellow of CIAT, also CABE. I'm a member of the Faculty of Party Wall Surveyors and Associate RICS. And I've got 18 years experience working with party walls. So the first placement I did was a surveying practice, which sort of did quite a bit of party wall work. And I was quite interested in it because the modules I'd studied at university around legal matters I was quite good at and I quite enjoyed. So it's something that I was quite passionate about. And I am a Bath fan. I'm disappointed with the result the weekend, if that is a question from anyone. So this is my team. I have a team of 30 multidisciplinary consultants. For a few different categories, so over the last couple of years, which is really nice. So what we're going to be looking at is our learning outcomes for today. So what I want to give you is an overview of the Party Wall Act, and apologise in advance if I'm teaching anyone to suck eggs, because I'm sure some of you have got vast experience of it, but hopefully it might refresh some things for you. Some knowledge to help advise your clients where and when to get advice. Some practical tips helping you in practice, and also learn some key terminology that we use as party wall surveyors. So the topics we're going to cover here, so we're going to have a look at the overview of the Act. We're going to talk about not dabbling. We're going to talk about types of notice. We're going to be thinking about boundaries, line of junction, where can you build? So where can you design your building to go? Excavation, when is it notifiable? Designing out the party wall and personalities, and I'll finish up with some sort of top 6 tips I've got for making things go smoothly. So overview of the Party Wall Act. So it's a facilitating act. So by that, what I mean is it's an act that helps you and encourages you to build near the boundary and allows that. So prior to the act, there wasn't really any legislation nationally which allowed you to do that, and it would create a lot of problems in terms of people getting into disputes. So it was brought in to remove those disputes and have a mechanism for dealing with it. Originates from kind of 1666, Great Fire of London, and when London realised actually we need to do something about our sort of fire safety and party walls and things and how buildings are built, and that results in London building acts and acts similarly in Bristol and Liverpool. And a little bit of quiz trivia for you. So 1391, as far back as that, Bristol, where I'm sat at the moment, had a surveyor that looked at these kind of things. So it's obviously party wall's been a hot topic for a long time. So a few key facts. So surveyors that deal with the Party Wall Act have to be neutral. And we say that we act on behalf of the wall, not a client. So interestingly, unlike other situations where there's a client and consultant role, we can't take direct instruction from someone. We actually call them appointing owners rather than clients. That's because we are acting on behalf of the act and the wall and not on behalf of the person carrying out the work or the person who's next door. Surveyors should be sort of practical people, and I say that because the whole point around this legislation was designed to keep it out of the hands of solicitors and be practical in their application of it. Having said that, it is quite marred in sort of legal jargon in some places. We use the term BO for building owner, and that's the person who's carrying out the work, and AO for adjoining owner, which is someone who is having the work done to them, if you want to probably phrase it a better way than that. But and also there is an option to use an agreed surveyor. So you can have two surveyors, one acting for each party, or you can have a surveyor who's agreed by both parties to settle a dispute. So these guys, we know they always do a cracking job. The Party Wall Act was hastily and poorly drafted, which means there's a lot of grey areas, there's a lot of areas that aren't very specific, and it's resulted in a lot of case law. It involves a service of notices before any work commence, and if those notices are dissented by the adjoining owner or the AO, it usually results in an award, a legally drawn up award, and a scheduled condition. So the next point we've got here is about dabbling. So my 18 years experience, I have come across sort of engineers, technologists, architects who don't do this as a kind of common thing and dabble in it. And it's just a bit of a word of warning, really, because anyone can be a party wall surveyor. There's no professional qualification required to do it. However, not everyone should be a party wall surveyor, I would say. So lots of people think, oh, if I read the Act or if I read a book about it, I'll understand how to apply it. And that's simply not true. So what I would say is if you are interested in dealing with party wall matters, then the Faculty of Party Wall Surveyors has an excellent vocational sort of training course on it, which you can go to, and also join up to the Pyramus and Thisbe Society, which is a society dedicated towards sort of excellence in party wall matters. So two good places to start that kind of learning journey, really. So typically there's three common types of notice that we deal with. There's a party structure notice, and that is anything where you are altering or adjusting a party structure. So that's kind of underpinning it, raising it, cutting in a beam as we've got up there. There's the line of junction notice, and that's where you're building a wall on a boundary or near a boundary. And there's an excavation notice, which we'll look at these in a little bit more detail in a bit. But the excavation notice deals with if you're digging for foundations or putting piling in. If it's within a certain distance of other properties, you will need to serve notice for them. So when is it a party wall? So I pinched this off another surveyor's website because I think it's an excellent diagram. It's really, really good. It's showing there that a shared wall between two properties is usually a party wall. And also that can apply to a party floor as well. So if you're in a flat, for instance, the same legislation applies for the floors that separate the buildings. And there's a thing called a party fence wall. Now, interestingly, it's nothing to do with an actual fence, but it's a stone or masonry or brick built wall that is sat on the line of junction. So it's got the same rights as a party wall, so people can enclose upon it and raise it and change it and do all those sorts of things. But it's not actually a fence. So it's a bit of wording in the Act, which is throws some people off sometimes. So thinking about the boundary, now this is really important because the boundary position and the adjoining structure determines the status of the wall. So we have two types of wall. So we have the type A party wall, and this is the traditional one, and that's where the boundary line sits within the structure of the wall, and it's enclosed upon, as in the first two diagrams. And then we have the type B party wall, which is where the boundary line is actually not between the wall, but the neighbour has enclosed upon it at some point. So interestingly, in the second of those diagrams, the one at the far right of the screen, it's only a party wall in that instance as far as it is enclosed. Above that, the building owner wouldn't have rights to adjust that wall. So it's only a party wall for the section that has already been enclosed. Coming on to this, so why is the status of the wall important? Well, actually, as I said before, it's a facilitating act. And actually, if you determine that it is a party wall, there are lots of things that you can do to that wall and lots of rights that you can get. And that informs our kind of design decisions going forward. hopefully not to end up with this kind of horrible situation that you commonly see here, where there's this horrible gap between extensions of buildings that is impossible to maintain and gets damp and full of rubbish. So rights include sort of raising a party wall, underpinning, thickening, cutting away, cutting into, etc., etc. There's lots of different things. And it's quite explicit on what you can and can't do in those circumstances. But the big one is access to build. And it's interesting because quite often I hear that my designer has said, pull it away from the boundary so that there's not an issue. In fact, I heard that just yesterday when I was on a call with a potential adjoining owner. And actually, that's quite bad advice, because Section 8 within the Act allows access to build. And it's one of the only pieces of legislation that allows access to build a new build or extension, whatever, and actually access the neighbour's land. And it's quite powerful in that regard. So sometimes actually placing the wall on the boundary is the right thing to do, because it will give your client potentially access to come in and build. And you also, if you are going to do that, you do need to think about trespassing. You do need to think about gutters and things like that, and how it's detailed so it doesn't kind of cause a trespass on the boundary there. So first sort of big tip of the day really is just thinking about the positioning of it. In terms of boundaries, how do we know where it is? Well, the first thing to say is party wall surveyors can't settle a boundary dispute. So if the neighbours are in dispute, we're not allowed to settle that. What I will say is try to get your clients to avoid boundary disputes. They're expensive, they're not good for people's health, they're stressful, and there's anything real good comes from them, other than solicitors make a lot of fees from them. So yeah, try to avoid them. Sometimes within the deeds, you can see that something is a boundary wall or is a party wall, or someone has responsibility for it, so that can be useful, but quite often they're silent. And most of the time it's kind of a practical decision that the surveyor takes, that we believe for the purpose of this award that the boundary is in kind of this sort of position. So how do we look at that? Well, there's things like we can look at the site evidence, so we can look at parapets, we can look at the exterior features like headers and things like that, and seeing where it is. Also, if we can get access to the neighbour's property, we can measure and we can actually figure out how thick the separating wall is between properties, and then we can kind of run that line outwards, and it gives us a starting point for where we think that boundary might start, and it helps to kind of add that evidence. I always say when you're on site, take as many photographs of the property that you're working on, but the neighbouring property as much as possible, including kind of adjacent heights if you can, because you can always refer back to that later if you're a bit unsure when you're doing your design about where it might be, the boundary. And I would always encourage as well people to, if they sort of think they know where the boundary is, try to show that on the plan, because it helps to kind of clarify things for the neighbour, but also for any surveyors that might get involved later where you were thinking the boundary was. Talking about sort of when it goes a bit wrong. So I received these plans a couple of weeks ago from a building owner who said, can I have a look at it and give them some advice on the party wall and act as surveyor for them? So, and this isn't by all means isolated. This happens, all the time. So I've received these plans, and I can see there's a little bit of detail on the side of the neighbours for the existing on both elevations, and I can see that probably there's a bit of a step there, because we can see the roof raised and we can see the grounds sort of a bit lower on the left hand side. I also looked on Google at the site, and I could see from the front of the property, actually, yes, there's a kind of, it's on quite a slope. So I'm expecting there to be some detailing. Actually, what I received was this, which this is the technical drawings showing it right up to the sort of boundary line. And interestingly, it's not taken into account that when I went to site, there's a 1.5 metre retaining wall to the right-hand side. So they clearly haven't really looked into very much detail with what was happening at the boundary. Doesn't account for damp proofing, doesn't account for structurally how that's not going to undermine that existing wall when we have to put this new wall in. So lots of things missing from it. And also on the left hand side there's a raising of the party wall, which that is not accounted for either. There's no drawings. There's this typical section. Well, this typical section is okay for perhaps the front of the building, but absolutely useless for the party wall surveyors. So if you are doing projects like this that will need party wall, I would say it's really, really important to actually draw those details, draw the details of how it connects both sides, how it's being raised, because if you don't do it now and it goes through for a party wall dispute, you'll certainly be asked to provide it later. And also, it sets the wrong tone. So if this goes over to another party wall surveyor, immediately they think, well, does this guy know what he's doing? You know, and I'm really going to look into it. And also it can end up costing your client more fees. So I have another example of this where I had advised the a building owner that actually the plans weren't suitable, and they said, well, they want to charge me another £700 or something for the other drawings. Can you just submit it to the neighbour and see where it goes? And I said, well, it's legal what we're serving, but if it goes to another surveyor, it won't look very good and it'll get questioned. Went to the other surveyor. The other surveyor exactly bounced straight back and said, look, these plans are no good. We need these details, these details, these details. And that happened 3 times. There was 3 evolutions of those plans. And what happened is they ended up paying a lot more to the other surveyor because those plans weren't in place, because he had to review 3 sets of plans rather than reviewing 1. So it can end up costing the client more. It's really good to just be thinking about those boundaries. So the line of junction, where can we build? Where can we design it to? So there's 2 common things that we can do. So we can build right up to the boundary line with a line of junction notice. We can also ask to straddle the boundary, and that has to have the express consent of the neighbour. Now, why would the neighbour give consent to that? Well, they can potentially use that wall in the future to build from. It avoids having a weird little gap when they try to build an extension in the future, which can get damp. And also it allows maintenance to the side of that wall. So actually, if they've got render or something, it doesn't become unsightly in the future. So there's a few good reasons why they might give access there to do that and to build it as a party wall rather than a boundary wall. So just looking at, again, express consent, and one of these sort of details that comes up and something to be thinking about is if you have a party fence wall, that wall that I said earlier, a bit like the one in the picture at the top there, which is not a party wall, but it's got the same rights as a party wall, you can replace that wall potentially under a party structure notice without having a line of junction notice. However, if that wall isn't long enough, you may need to extend it further, and if you do not get express consent for that extra piece of wall, you may have to have a dog leg in the building that you're designing, so it would end up looking in plan something like we have there in that diagram. Excavation. So when are excavations notifiable? So there's 2 types of notices under excavation. There's a 3 metre and a 6 metre notice. 3 metre notice only comes into play where you're going deeper than the neighbour's footing, and you're within 3 metres. Standard sort of type footings, strip footings or mass fill footings. Interestingly, most properties in this country, sort of pre-late 70s, won't tend to have foundations that are as deep as we put in today. So if you are building next to a property that is older than kind of the late 70s, which most of our building stock is, then you are likely to need to have a 3 metre notice if you're within 3 metres. Interestingly, this talks about excavation and structure. Now, you have to be careful with this because there are things that haven't necessarily gone through case law at the moment, but are being pushed by barristers in the party wall world, where they are trying to consider other things as such as a simple pathway as a structure. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that from my professional point of view, but that is sometimes where it's going. So it's not always, whilst the diagrams that the government issue and everything always focuses around buildings and things like that and footings, actually it could apply to other things. So the other one is a 6 metre notice, and that's where you tend to be doing something like a piled excavation, and that has to be within 6 metres and cut through a 45-degree angle from the bottom of the footing. It's not from the edge of the footing, strangely, it's from the outer width of the wall as you sort of carry that line downwards to the footing. Not actually how it works in reality from an engineering perspective, but again, one of these kind of strange quirks of the way that it's drafted. So what I would say with any of these, it's the one that catches people out the most, the excavation notice, because sometimes it's quite clear that a party structure notice or a line of junction notice isn't needed, but it's not always clear about the excavation notice. So do just be careful if you're advising clients whether you think they need it or not. It is more often than not, if you are in close proximity, it will come into play. And if you're unsure, speak to a party wall surveyor. So there is a part in the Act, and a commonly held view is that the Act says I can put my footings on the neighbour's land. So when I put my wall on the line of junction, I can extend my footings over onto the neighbour's land. Well, that is in there, and I think that's probably what it was meant for in the Act. The problem is there was a piece of terminology that said where necessary, and through case law and practice, it's now considered not necessary in most instances to put a footing on someone else's land, because you can do an asymmetrically loaded footing, as we've got here. This is in section, which would essentially, NHBC has a standard for this as well, doing this, allow you to build right on the edge of the toe of the footing, so without encroaching onto the neighbour's land. So it's not necessary perhaps to do that in very few cases. The other thing I would say here from just a pertinent point is, if you are designing anything that you think needs to go over, if you have any still work inside of that footing, rebar or whatever, it becomes a special foundation, and you cannot put that on without express consent of the neighbour. So again, looking at where that might happen, typical basement conversions and things like that, where you've got to dig down, just be very careful when you're kind of organising with the engineer about how that's going to work. So let's talk about designing it out. So there is case law which says actually it's okay to design the party wall act out. There was a case where essentially the adjoining owner was saying, well, they've just designed it in that way to get around the Act, and it's a bit of a folly. And the judge said, well, yes, but if it's designed in that way, if it doesn't come into play, it doesn't come into play. So it is okay to design it out, but what I would say is be really, really careful if you're doing that, because there's lots of things that can trip people up in the nuances of it. So always consult with a party wall surveyor if that's what you're trying to do. And get them in for an hour or so just to consult and give you some advice on the sort of technicalities of it. So to give you an example here, this is a loft conversion. You've got a ridge beam running in that we can see there, and typically this would be pocketed into the party wall and would require party structure notice. You might decide that the neighbour is so difficult and so aggressive and so hard to deal with that you were going to not have it doing that, because it's just going to be more hassle than it's worth. So what you could do in theory is you could have a wall that spans in the floor, a beam, sorry, in the floor, which goes out to the outer wall and to a spine wall. And then you place a post between the two to carry the end of that beam rather than pocketing it out. And it could be, if none of this is fixed back to the party wall, that doesn't require party wall consent. So it's a way of designing it out. But I would say always consult with a party wall if you are trying to do that. Thinking about personalities. Now, I think one of the biggest things with anything in life, I suppose, but more often not with party walls, is that a lot of what happens comes down to the individuals involved, and that's not just the building owner and the adjoining owner, it's also the surveyors involved. So thinking sort of long and hard about kind of those people that are involved and who you sort of suggest to do these things. So surveyors typically, there's sort of personalities. You get people that are very technically driven, very detail focused. It's quite a common personality trait. You do get the pragmatic surveyors, which are perhaps have a little bit more on-site experience, that look at pragmatism and moving things on and looking at it that way. You get some which are bad. In all honesty, in my 18 years, I have come across a few of them. Perhaps the ones I always think raises alarm bells are what we call the sort of ambulance chaser ones, which are they send letters from planning permission, say to neighbours, riling them up, saying make sure you've served notice and all these kind of things. So it's you do get those types of characters, and you also get what I call the kind of rock star surveyors who they are sort of they're so involved with the legal aspect of it, they're almost quasi solicitors. They usually charge a very high fee, There is a common misconception, I think, that if people charge high fees, they do things quickly. I don't think that's always the case either. But there are certainly projects where that kind of person could be really, really helpful if it's kind of groundbreaking what you're trying to do there, and it's kind of right on the edge of the act and what's available to do. That could be the right sort of person. You've got building owners. Now, it could be that, we hopefully all deal with clients and very different personalities involved, and trying to match someone that's suitable in terms of the surveyor to the person involved, I think is quite important. And that's not always to placate the building owner, because if we go back to what I was saying before about people being the building owners and the surveyor acting impartially, actually sometimes it's really important that the building owner is directed in the proper way by the surveyor. So sometimes actually to have a surveyor that's quite officious and technically driven and will send them down the correct path is more important than having someone that will placate them. So just be thinking about the kind of right personalities that you want to put together there. And adjoining owners as well. It's thinking about the personalities again that are involved. Would I put my, if I had the adjoining owner was a lovely little old lady who was really nice and just wanted to understand it a bit more, would I set the rock star or the officious surveyor on her? Probably not. It's probably not the right person, and I'd probably be suggesting that they speak to someone who's a little bit more gentle and takes them through the process, a bit more consultative. So it's just thinking about matching up personalities, and just got a kind of bit of an interesting tell of that really. So I had a very nice building owner who he had his grounds were surrounded by really thick rubble stone walls. They were collapsing in places. And he asked me to serve notice to the neighbour to rebuild them, and he was willing to pay for it all, wanted to just get it sorted. Unfortunately, the neighbour on the adjoining owner side was really a bit of piece of work. He was a wealthy retired solicitor and determined to throw the book at the building owner and not allow him access on his land, and very, very determined. He appointed a very officious party wall surveyor. Now, the point here is that he was a very officious party wall surveyor, but he's also a very good party wall surveyor who wasn't going to let the person bully him around, and he was going to direct it and work for the act, not for them. So he took my points on board that their land was a little bit higher and it was retaining a bit of their land and all these sorts of things. So they would benefit from a bit more. And there was some vegetation there, which would have caused more detriment to the wall their side than our side and these things. And eventually agreed to a 70% cost going to the adjoining owner, including his fees, and 30% going to the building owner. So, it doesn't always pay with personalities to have the most officious person, and I would say this is a word of warning for people who think that's always the way to go, because good party wall surveyors will administer the act properly, and they won't fight the case, as it were, for the adjoining owner. They will do it professionally and diligently. So that brings me on to my top tips. So first tip is to always consult a party wall surveyor if you can quite early on in the process, especially if it's quite a complex scheme. So at WBC, for instance, we offer not as party wall surveyor, but as a consultation process, we offer for sort of larger development sites a report about ways that they could mitigate risk around party wall and kind of what sort of cost implications they might be getting into if they do get into party wall awards with multiple neighbours. Always detail as much information as you have at the boundary on your plans. It makes it much more useful. It will save surveyors time. It will make you look wonderful to the surveyors and they won't question your competency. And also it saves you from kind of awkward questions from the client. Well, what did you think about that before? So it's always a really good thing to do. Always provide a sectional drawing of the footings in relation to the adjoining owners, or get the engineer to do it if you are asking the engineer to cover all the Part A stuff. And the reason for that is it is a requirement of an excavation notice to have one of those drawings, so you have to have that anyway. You will get asked for it before it can legally be served. let your client know sort of at an early stage that there is a time and expense delay that can occur with party wall awards. So, most party wall awards are wrapped up in within around sort of a month, I would say. However, there are some horror stories that we've had which have taken 9 months to conclude because there's so much complexity to them. So that's a delay. Nothing else really can march on and start on site until that was signed off. So having that conversation with them earlier on, saying, look, this is a risk because there's a lot of parties which are outside of the design team that are having an influence on it. So it's really good for them to know that. Um, Always recommend a schedule of condition, even if no formal awards are being signed. And that's because the nature of what I've seen over the last 18 years is the human nature is someone might be absolutely fine with their neighbour building an extension, for instance, but as soon as there's vibration and there's noise, people start looking at their own properties and they start to see cracks. And those cracks have probably been there for the whole time, but they'll only see them once there's a bit of vibration, and straight away they'll blame the building owner for those cracks, and then you end up in a bit of a bun fight about whose fault it is. It protects both parties to have a schedule of condition, and it's a really good thing to do. It records the condition prior to the work starting, and it takes any of that kind of grey area away about were they or weren't they there before. So a really good thing to do. Um, if being asked by an adjoining owner, and we get this sometimes, oh, they've suggested a agreed surveyor, is that okay? I think people's first response quite often is no, get your own surveyor, get your own representation. Um, just be careful on that. And only that there has been sort of relatively recent case law where someone did that. They appointed their own surveyor, ended up in court, and the judge actually said, well, I think this should have been done by an agreed surveyor because I think it's a very simple thing they're doing. And actually, you've blown this all out of proportion. You can pay your surveyor fees because normally the surveyor's fees are covered by the building owner, both surveyors, and actually put all the costs involved with it and bring it to court all onto the adjoining owner. So it can be a risky strategy. If it's a very simple matter that can be administered, then actually an agreed surveyor might be a suitable thing to do. And also encourage early communication between parties in a spirit of cooperation. So if you can, and they get on with them enough, get neighbours to chat, get them to show them planning drawings before they go in for planning, because quite often people that don't do that, when it comes to the party wall, the adjoining owner will see it as a weapon to get back at them for not consulting them and speaking to them about it. So that early sort of talking and communication, even if it doesn't go the right way, at least you've tried. And a really good example of this, we had last year I had a project where there was a £200,000 rebuild of a retaining wall, major retaining wall. Had 6 adjoining owners, where the work was going to have to be done in their garden, and 2 building owners. And it all started out that they were going to they weren't going to allow them access, and they unless they did this and paid for this and things. And they got me on board. I sat down with them. I did an early consultation with them. I explained both rights to both parties, and actually they could gain access. You couldn't really stop them for the work that was there. It was necessary work, and it was necessary to gain access. And they came away from that and they all actually agreed it. So they didn't even need party wall awards because we were able to negotiate. And what started out as could have been very expensive in terms of 6 awards and lots of expense actually turned out to be, and that wall's now finished and there's no problems with the party wall and it went very smoothly. So early engagement's super important for that kind of thing. So and that just leads me to the questions. So Usman, sort of back over to you, I guess.
Wicked, thank you for that, James. I must stress that the topics raised were very in depth and would, as James suggested, require further learning for you to sort of understand better. I know obviously some will be covered in the talk very briefly, and also there could be some bits that are raised in questions. If you do have any very specific site issues where you are dealing with party wall matters, I suggest you either reach out to your regular surveyor who you're dealing with, or obviously I'm sure James, please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure James would be happy to sort of have a chat about those specific issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So we've got a few questions, and I've also written a few just in case. We've got a question in from Richard. What do you do with a building owner that don't use party wall agreements when working on party walls?
So if you're acting for that building owner, you need to, very clearly point out to them it's a legal requirement to do so. Um, if they don't follow that advice, that's down to them, but they are at risk of getting things like injunctions and things like that. And there are instances where this happens. I would say all you can do is advise, but ultimately, if it's their site and they choose to kind of not do it, then ultimately they're kind of, well, they're breaking the law and opening themselves up to more expense, I would say, legally.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated matter. If you're going to do notifiable works without serving relevant notices, it gets very complicated. I've dealt with a number of cases. I know James has dealt with those of cases, and people up and down the country have also. That's why you have case law. That's why you have extremely difficult situations. You have disputes ongoing for many years. You have, as James has mentioned, a very expensive rectification sort of phase. So there's lots of things to worry about. And
I
obviously,
mean, what I would say is in terms of if a notice is served, just the notice, and then the parties agree to it, and there's a dispute later, you can bring surveyors in to deal with that dispute. But if that notice hasn't been served, surveyors can't. The only people that can deal with that really are solicitors, and that gets expensive. And and what we should be saying to people is within your budget, you need to budget some fees for a party wall surveyor. And actually, if they don't use that because actually the neighbours agreed to it and it's a low cost, great, but actually expect to have to pay an X amount for surveyors fees.
we've got some other questions in. So, are you happy to share the slides with the people who attended?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
No problem. Yeah, we'll ping that across to everyone who's registered via the email. Will get sent out as part of our normal circular. Um, Interesting one in from Carl. It's always difficult to find where the line of junction is. Any tips on that?
Yeah, so I think that the big one is, as I said in there, if you can get in and measure the neighbour's property, it's quite useful because you can actually kind of work out the party wall thickness and you can extrapolate where the centre of that wall is out. So at least give you a starting point from on the outside of the wall generally. Um, you can also look at sometimes it's figuring out when things were built in what order. So actually, I know here in the West we've got a website called Know Your Place, which has free historical mapping, and that can be really good at determining when you think things were built. For instance, if you've got retaining walls, I did one in Bedminster in Bristol a few years back that I was able to determine that a yard of a warehouse was built about 50 years before the houses behind it, which meant that they would have put that retaining wall in to create the yard. So I could demonstrate that that wall was their responsibility, because usually it would be the person whose land it was retaining, but they had put it in first to scrape back their land and make it flat, basically. So there are things that you can look at in terms of historical mapping as well as the deeds.
Great. Question in from Joe. What about a garden fence on a low garden wall, I presume a masonry wall, both astride the boundary? What actions are notifiable?
So the bottom of the wall, the masonry wall, would be, if it's astride the boundary, would be a party fence wall, and therefore any work you do to that is notifiable. But you do have rights to put, if you were putting a wall there, to take that down and put a wall back in that position astride the boundary. So actually, it is kind of a useful thing rather than being a hindrance, I would say.
Great. A question in from Lyndon. Some of my clients, when advised, have used a letter template found online to use and ask their adjoining owner to sign. How effective is this letter if there is a dispute?
Interestingly, so it's quite often, so we get these all the time. We get appointments from this where someone sent their own letter. So the first thing we do as surveyors is we say, give me a copy of that notice you've sent, because I want to critique it and make sure it's legal. Because if this ends up in court, I want to be able to stand there and go, I believe that was legal. And I would say, I wouldn't like to put a percentage on it, but probably 3 out of 4 of them are wrong, and they've served the wrong thing or they've said the wrong thing and probably wouldn't stand up in court. Now, the courts are generally more relaxed if a person has tried to do it themselves than if I did it and got it wrong. They tend to take a dimmer view of that. But what I will say is it can be done, and people do it, and it is regular. more often than not, there's a few curveballs out there where they combine notices and things. Like you might have a party structure notice, which is amalgamated into a excavation notice, and it all gets a bit messy, and then not the right terminology is used, and they don't know whether to tick the right things. It's better to pay a surveyor a couple of £100 to look at it and do it properly, is what I would say.
Yeah. On that, there's a few other questions, but I'll dive in with a few from me. So, just if you could recap, what notices are there as part of the Party Wall Act?
So there's other notices which I didn't come on to, but they tend to be used in the other direction from adjoining owner to building owner. But the three main notices, you have the excavation notice, you have the party structure notices, and you have the line of junction notice. And those are the three that are commonly served by the building owner upon the adjoining owner.
Great. And then you mentioned schedule of condition and you briefly explained it. Can you just go into a
Hmm.
little bit more detail about what that is and how that
Yeah.
differs from what is expected? And also as well, it's become almost conjoined with the services. However, it's not prescribed and required. So you can
No.
just go into that a little bit more, please.
Yeah, so with schedule condition, it's a very detailed recording. So generally, what we will do is we will go into a room and we will list each item out in the room. So we'll say floor, then we'll give a description of the finish, and then we'll give a description of any kind of condition or defects that are there. And we do that with all of the bits in the room, down to kind of do the windows open without binding, do the doors open without binding. Is there any existing hairline cracking in the plaster or the coving or whatever? So it's quite a detailed record of what's there, and as I said, you need that detail. In terms of the requirement for it, actually, the Act doesn't say you've got to have one of these things. It's not something, but it's universally accepted that without it, the kind of award doesn't hold much teeth in terms of damage, and it can be really difficult to establish who's caused what damage. So it's become a standard thing to do, and the only time in my 18 years that we haven't done it is where we haven't got access, and that's because we haven't been able to get hold of the adjoining owner over a period of months, and we have requested access and it's not been given, but we can't hold up because it's a facilitating act. We can't stop the building owner from going on and doing it. So we got to say, okay, well, you've just got to go on and do it, and we just won't be able to do this schedule of condition for you because we can't get in physically to do it. So just to expand upon that, if you have a adjoining owner who's non-responsive, there is mechanisms within the Act to actually move that on and actually move that down the process without any interaction from them at all. Because if they don't contact you, again, because it's facilitating, they can't just ignore it. It will just march on without them. And we appoint a surveyor on their behalf, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So under 10.4b, you would appoint a
Mm.
joining owner surveyor on their behalf. Um, uh, and basically move on with it. And you can obviously carry out schedule a condition from the outside, but it very much depends on a case by case basis. We've done a number of those, haven't we, together?
Yes.
Um, Draft award. What is a draft award?
So, a draft award is essentially it's the legal document that gets signed off the end. The draft version of it is a kind of travelling document that we send between surveyors, which has the main kind of pertinent points of what people can do. So it might contain about kind of what hours the party wall can be worked on, how it can be done. Can it be done with hand tools? Can it be done with mechanical tools? Is there any usually attached to that are the drawings, perhaps method statements that have been requested from the party wall surveyors, like excavation method statements and things like this. Insurances, although we've been asked not to kind of elaborate on insurances generally, but just that there is an insurance in place. But yeah, it's that document that goes back and forwards between surveyors to ultimately have the sort of agreement at the end of it.
Great. I'll go back into the question. So Callum's asking, I am designing some new build terraced housing. Does a party wall require a specific size of cavity between structures? Is one wall acceptable, i.e. no cavity if it meets acoustic, etc. requirements? Any regulations I should be aware of? It's a very detailed question. Very
Yeah,
site
so
specific as well. Um,
uh, the
Please
so sorry.
lightly respond. Don't go into
Yeah,
too much
what
detail.
what I
Site
would
specific stuff,
say,
please get in touch in directly, please. But sorry, carry on,
yeah,
James.
well, what I would say is that there's no design requirements within the Party Wall Act, so it doesn't say you've got to design it a certain way. So if it meets building regulations for fire and sound and structure, then it's acceptable. That's the only thing that's in there, that all works need to be designed to building regulations and CDM and all those other related regulations that go with it. But as long as it meets all those, there's not a specific sort of detail that they give within the Party Wall Act for how it should be done.
We've got another one which is a little bit specific, but let's go with it. Keith, thoughts on a new timber frame wall on former fence line between two properties, 2 meters apart, being replaced and on shallow metal screw piles? That's mean asking such a detailed question.
So, I mean, is it possible, I suppose, is what you're asking? And I guess, depending on detail, yes, it could be. So, again, as long as the design meets building regulations and is coming back to that point, there's no prescriptive way within the Party Wall Act to say you must do this a certain way. It's not that kind of controlling. It just says it must meet building regulations. So as long as you can demonstrate that it meets building regulations, then that's possible. One thing with timber framing, obviously the big thing, fire is a hot topic since Grenfell. Lots of us, I'm sure, have suffered with trying to get insurance for any kind of fire design and that kind of thing. Is timber frames really, they've got to be sheathed in an outer skin of something that's not combustible. So your sort of standard timber framing needs to be upgraded with cement board or something like that, similar.
Great, thanks for that. Neris asked, does a party wall surveyor carry out a schedule of condition as part of their appointment, or do we need a separate building surveyor?
No, most Party Wall surveyors will carry it out as part of their appointment, and will be included within their fees usually.
Great. Question in from Mustafa, does the party wall notice have an expiry date, and what would happen if the neighbours would not communicate? And I presume as well, furthermore, is if the adjoining owner were to change ownership. Probably let's add that into there.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Good. Got 3 things. So start off with the first one again. I forgot this one.
Expiry.
Expiry. Yeah. So they have a party wall notices. Have a notice period on them, varying usually between 2 and 1 month, depending on the type of notice that you're serving. Normally, you would expect those to be sort of valid for 12 months. The thing that does have a definitive time is the party wall award itself. So if a party wall award is served, usually the party wall award from the date that it's signed lasts for 12 months. So if the work isn't started within 12 months, then a new party wall award needs to be signed and done, if that makes sense. I have had in the past where someone has said, actually, we're not going to start this for 18 months. Can it be extended? And I've had surveyors agree to it. And I've had other surveyors that say they won't agree to it. So again, this is one of these grey nuance areas that actually doesn't really say in the Act. It's people's interpretation of it. And what was the other question there, Osman, in that? It was.
I believe we covered from our previous conversation. I believe we covered about non-communication, because of the act is an enabling act. Just to go over that, so therefore there's mechanisms in it to basically continue. James could obviously go into detail, but I've even had conversations with people who are thinking that this is now another point to potentially pause the thing that they don't want their neighbour doing. So just to bear in mind, if it's been approved and it's all lawful, the Party Wall Act isn't there to stop you.
And you said something on the third one. I can't remember what you said about that.
And when the award expires, but I think you answered that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah.
We've got a question in from Chris. Does Section 8 cover erection of scaffold to work at high levels on adjoining owner's land? I had a very difficult adjoining owner before on a new house project.
So, Chris, really good question. So Section 8 comes into play where there is notifiable work. So if you were erecting that scaffolding for something that's not notifiable, then no, it doesn't come into play. However, if you're erecting that scaffolding for something that is notifiable, i.e. you are building a wall right up to the boundary, then you can erect that scaffolding to build that wall, and the adjoining owner essentially has to give you access for it. Where it comes into a little bit of debate is when you get to the roof. So can you keep that scaffolding up for the roof? Well, usually by that point, pragmatically, you're up to the roof anyway, and it's worked on, and the adjoining owners accepted their fate of having this scaffolding there, right? But generally speaking, I'm a big advocate of putting parapet walls in. For two reasons. One, you can work all the way up to those parapet walls and you can finish them off, and then you can work from your side potentially to get the rest of it done. But also, if they come to do any of their own works in the future, it means they don't have to mess around with your client's structure and stuff like that. They can just cut straight into that and utilize it as is.
There's a few more questions. I know we've gone over time slightly, but what I'll do is there's three more if we just do it real quick. So we've got one from U Architecture. If exact boundary line is not very clear and the boundary owner ended up constructing a rear extension encroaching the boundary line, who will be liable? Building owner, designer, architect, party wall surveyor, etc.
So if they've gone through the party wall process, the chances are that if it's not obvious where the boundary line is, then it's never going to be obvious, is the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is the only way that that would get questioned is if there was a live boundary dispute. And interestingly, surveyors cannot sign a ward off where there's a boundary dispute. So if that boundary was being disputed, you cannot sign it off. What surveyors usually put within their awards is something that says along the lines of, we've determined the boundary in relation to the Party Wall Act, so what we think is reasonable. I don't think, Usman, have you ever come across a case where retrospectively someone's come back after there's been a Party Wall award and said, oh, this is wrong? I don't think I have had that.
Yeah, I've had that. We've had to negotiate between the adjoining owner and the building owner. Took a long time, it cost a lot of money. Ended up having to do some adjustments to details, and so it was, yes, it goes back to what James said earlier on. Try and do it before, make sure you do all of the due diligence, the right process, and you're following a prescribed route. And if you're unsure, double check things. So double check the line of junction, double check where things are being built, and also make sure that the client is aware that they need to use a contractor that is actually looking at the drawings and understand the importance of where things are being placed.
What I would say, Usman, is one of the things that comes up with this is there is there's a sentence in the Act for party structure notices that say that you can thicken a wall. So if you have got that party fence wall that we've spoken about, it's my view that actually you may, and it's allowed, to encroach a bit further onto the neighbour's property in that instance, because you're thickening a wall to make sure that it complies to building regulations. And you just like not potentially, if it's a standard 215mm brick wall, you're not going to really design it down to that size with modern insulation standards. And there's a requirement to thicken there. And I think that you can encroach a little bit more in that instance. What you couldn't do, if there was only a fence there before, not a party fence wall, you couldn't encroach unless they expressly said next door, yeah, it's okay for you to do so.
So just going to do a final one, which hopefully should help everyone in regards to sort of further questions. James, could you just give us a pointer in regards to further courses, books, and sort of general further learnings on this subject matter if someone was interested in learning more?
Yeah, so definitely. So the first thing I would do, if I didn't have any knowledge of the Party Wall Act, the government issue a red booklet, which is an explanatory booklet, and that's written in plain English, and it's designed for the clients to read, essentially. But it's a really good place to start. Now, not everything in there is probably 100% correct, actually, in terms of implementation of the Act, but it's a really, really good place to start and start that kind of learning from. Then what I would suggest is, as I said, the Faculty of Party Wall Surveyors does do a course. I believe they do that online as well as in person now, but I would say that in person is better because you can sketch things out and give it to the guy and go, what about this? What about that? And I think it works slightly better. That's a really, really good place. Books, there is something in the P&T Society, which we call the Green Book, which is a really useful tool to look at. And I think most party wall surveyors keep a copy of that on their desk and pick it up when they want to read the Act, because it has the Act laid out in there, but under each section it explains it and gives some clearance. So, I mean, it's interesting with party walls that it's one of the few topics in my professional life that I'm constantly learning new things because there's so many grey areas and loopholes and case laws evolving from it that I feel like monthly I'm learning something new that I've been doing it for 18 years. I feel like I shouldn't be learning this much, but yeah, it's something that there's always that, and I would say that's a really useful thing to get. There are lots of other books out there when you get deeper into it, but they can be a bit dry and hard to consume, and they're not really reference books. So that's where I'd start with it.
Great. I think we'll leave it there because we've gone a little bit over time, and I don't want us to sort of break out into post lunch break. So, honestly, thank you, James, for that. Thank you everyone for attending. Just bear in mind, we do have more talks already scheduled for the rest of this year and also going into next year. We only have a few vacancies for 2025. I think it's 4 or 5 months gap wise. I think it's all been sent out via CIAT's mailer. So everyone should have a bit of an idea in regards to sort of signposting dates to book out for the lunches to attend all of the CPD and 43s for the next year and a half. So please do, if you have any suggestions, please let me know. We're more than happy to sort of field those, look at those. If you have specific point of contacts, then we're happy to speak to them as well. But thank you again. Thank you, James. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for having me. Cheers. Thank you.